The night it happened, I wasn't looking for trouble. Just trying to fall asleep in the quiet apartment with the hum of the ceiling fan cutting through the silence when his phone buzzed on the dresser screen, lighting up with that familiar map of the Uber app. A thin blue line ending not far from where I knew she lived. A cluster of low-rise buildings near the marina. And the timestamp made my throat close, 12:17 a.m., long after he said the business dinner had wrapped up. Long after he should have been halfway across town, maybe already asleep beside me. But instead the app showed him dropping someone off. And the little pin was practically on her street. The same street where last week I'd driven by and seen her red Corolla parked crooked. The same street he swore he didn't know. My chest tightened as I traced the ride backwards. From the downtown steakhouse to that stop near her apartment. And though I told myself maybe it was a coincidence, maybe he'd shared a ride with a client, my stomach rolled at the thought. Because I knew her name had been whispered in our office corridors. Her laugh echoing too bright in meetings. Her texts popping up on his screen once when he left it unlocked on the counter. Next time. Your turn, with a winking emoji I tried to swallow down, lying there in the half-dark. Phone clutch like evidence. I remembered the last time he came home late. Shirt faintly smelling of perfume that wasn't mine. A fruity sharp scent that lingered even after the shower. And how he'd kissed me quickly before rolling away. I thought of the way she touched his arm when presenting at last month's All Hands. Subtle but not invisible, and the way his eyes darted to mine as if to check if I'd noticed. Now, staring at the glowing route on the map, I felt the ground shift. Because this wasn't suspicion anymore, this was coordinates and timestamps. Proof tucked neatly in my palm, and yet instead of screaming I lay there, silent. Listening to the fan and the ticking clock, waiting for the sound of his key in the lock. Rehearsing in my head a dozen questions I might never ask. Because part of me still wanted to believe he'd walk in with some explanation that didn't end with me realizing the marriage I'd built was already crumbling. When the door finally opened, it wasn't the slam of a guilty man but the careful push of someone trying not to wake the household, his shoes in his hand, tie stuffed into his pocket. And he offered a sheepish smile that should have belonged to a husband late from work. Not one who had just been near her apartment after midnight. And I studied him in the dim light, every movement slow, deliberate. Like he knew he was being watched, he kissed my forehead as though it were enough. Then collapsed onto his side of the bed without a word about the dinner, no details, no names. Just silence, and I lay there stiff as stone, clutching the phone under the sheet. Heat burning in my chest. Morning came with the smell of his coffee brewing. The clatter of mugs, and he acted normal, chatting about a new project. How exhausted he was from endless client talk, and I forced myself to nod. Eyes on the Uber icon still open on my screen. Replaying the ride like a film I couldn't shut off. At work the whispers about him and Leora grew sharper, her name bending around cubicles. Her perfume trailing the halls like a warning. And when she stopped at his desk I caught the tilt of her smile, the flicker in his eyes. And it made my stomach pitch. Lunchtime, I scrolled through the ride history again. Fingers trembling as though repetition might alter the truth, but the map was merciless. Still ending on her street, the timestamp unchanging. I wanted to scream at him across the polished cafeteria tables. Wanted to fling the evidence in his face, but my throat sealed shut. Because confrontation meant finality, meant admitting that what I'd feared for months was real. Instead I swallowed my rage, smiled at colleagues. and later in the bathroom locked the stall and pressed my forehead to the cool metal. Replaying every tiny sign I had ignored, the late nights, the sudden interest in cologne. The way his phone always seemed face down. That night he slid into bed early, arm draped over me as if nothing had shifted, his breath even, and I stared at the ceiling, wondering if this was how betrayal worked, not as a dramatic explosion but as a quiet accumulation of roots, timestamps, and perfume notes, until a wife's faith rotted from the inside out. The following evening I tested him, casually asking about the dinner, who had been there, what time it ended, and he answered smoothly, naming colleagues, inventing small anecdotes about a client's bad joke. Details rehearsed enough to sound real but hollow enough to echo. And I nodded while watching the twitch at the corner of his mouth. Later, when he stepped into the shower, I picked up his blazer and checked the pockets, finding nothing but a crumpled valet ticket from downtown and a folded receipt from a wine bar I hadn't known he liked, timestamped 11:42 p.m. And my chest pulsed because that meant there had been no straight ride home. No urgency to return to me, just lingering in dim light with someone else. I tucked the receipt back exactly as I found it, heart pounding. And when he emerged wrapped in a towel, he kissed me with a softness that made bile rise, as though he could mask every deception with tenderness. The days blurred into a rhythm of pretending. Me playing the dutiful wife while secretly cataloging evidence, every Uber ping a dagger, every late return another stitch unraveling. On Friday he claimed he'd be at a networking mixer, and I watched his car icon leave the neighborhood, then disappear, so I ordered my own ride, directing the driver to the Marina District, my pulse thrumming louder with every block. I told myself I might see nothing, that I was paranoid. But when we pulled onto her street, I spotted his SUV idling by the curb, engine still running. And then the passenger door opened and Leora stepped out, her laugh sharp in the night air, her hand brushing his shoulder before she leaned in, whispering something that made his smile stretch wider than it had for me in months. I ducked down in the back seat, breath ragged, fingers digging into the leather strap of my purse, and felt the heat of humiliation crawl up my neck as he drove off, oblivious, leaving her standing on the sidewalk with her keys in hand. My driver asked if I wanted to get out, and I shook my head, whispering home, because I couldn't risk being seen, not yet. Not until I decided whether I would explode the truth into his face or keep suffocating under the weight of coordinates and receipts and the sound of another woman's laugh staining the night. The weekend stretched out like a punishment, his body present but his mind elsewhere, scrolling his phone with quick flicks of his thumb, setting it face down whenever I came too close, and I moved through the house like a ghost, watching him mow the lawn, fix a loose cabinet hinge, all the small chores of a normal husband, while the image of his SUV idling outside her building replayed in a vicious loop. Sunday morning, while he showered, I opened his laptop under the pretense of checking a recipe and found his Uber account still logged in, the ride history scrolling like a confession. Multiple late-night drop-offs on her street, not once, not twice, but at least 6 in the last month, each timestamp a nail in the coffin of my denial. And I snapped the lid shut just as the water turned off, heart hammering so hard I thought he might hear it through the bathroom door. I spent the afternoon baking a pie I didn't even want, hands shaking as I rolled dough, because doing something ordinary kept me from screaming. But when he walked in and kissed the top of my head, I almost hurled the rolling pin across the room, instead forcing a smile so brittle it could have shattered. That night, lying beside him, I imagined confronting him with the evidence. Imagined shouting the names of those streets and hours until he broke. But the words stayed locked in my chest, strangling me. Because part of me still craved the life we'd built, the dinners with friends, the vacations framed in photos on the wall, and if I said it aloud, if I accused him, the facade would shatter for good, so I buried the proof in silence. But silence has a way of poisoning, and by Monday morning I felt it seeping out in sharp edges. In the clipped way I answered his questions. In the stiffness of my shoulders when he touched me, and though he pretended not to notice, I caught the flicker of wariness in his eyes, a recognition that I was no longer blind. And that knowledge, that sliver of fear on his face, was the only thing keeping me from collapsing entirely. On Monday night I told him I had a late meeting. But instead of staying at the office I parked a few blocks from the marina. Heart pounding so hard it rattled my ribs, and waited in the dim interior of my car. Fingers cold despite the summer heat. Around 11 his SUV slid into the street like a shadow returning home. Headlights sweeping across my windshield, and I ducked low, watching as he pulled up to the curb, engine idling. A few minutes later she appeared, Leora. Hair pulled into a careless knot, clutching a tote bag as though this were routine. Sliding into the passenger seat with ease, no hesitation, no glance around. As if she knew this car had become hers after dark, they didn't drive off immediately. Instead sat there talking, silhouettes close. His hand resting on the gearshift but leaning toward her, and though I couldn't hear the words, the cadence of his body told me enough. It was intimacy, practiced and safe. Rage clawed through me, not the hot screaming kind but a cold, surgical fury. The kind that etched every detail into memory for later use. I stayed long enough to see her laugh, head tilted back, his grin catching the dashboard light, before the SUV eased away, disappearing down the street. My hands shook as I started my own engine, following at a careful distance. But after a few blocks I pulled over, chest heaving, realizing I couldn't trail them into whatever hotel or hidden corner they were heading toward. That watching was already shredding me. Instead I drove home in silence. Headlights blurring through tears, parked in the driveway, and sat there until dawn streaked the horizon, the house behind me suddenly foreign. A stage set for a play I no longer believed in. When he finally returned, shoes in his hand like always, I met his eyes for the first time with the weight of everything I knew, and though I said nothing, he froze in the doorway as if my silence had finally spoken louder than any accusation could. The following days unfolded like a dangerous game of charades. Both of us pretending nothing had shifted, though every glance carried the weight of unspoken knowledge. He tried harder, suddenly volunteering to cook dinner, suggesting we go for walks, even booking a couple's massage for Saturday. Gestures that might have fooled an outsider but to me reeked of guilt management. A frantic attempt to plaster over cracks too wide to hide. I played along, smiled when I had to, but my mind never left the glow of those Uber receipts. The sight of Leora slipping into his car, the way their heads bent toward each other like conspirators, and the act of pretending began to erode me. At work I avoided her, dodging her bright greetings, her questions about weekend plans, because I couldn't stand the thought of her nails leaving crescents on his arm while she asked me about mine. By Friday I'd decided to test him again, telling him I had to fly to Dallas for a conference, fabricating an itinerary so detailed he couldn't doubt it, and his relief was almost too quick. Too easy, like a man handed a weekend pass to freedom. That night I drove not to the airport but back to the marina. Parking in the shadows with a thermos of coffee. Watching the street where I knew his SUV would appear. And when it finally did, my stomach clenched, not just because Leora was there again, sliding into his passenger seat like she belonged, but because this time he got out first. Walked around to open the door for her. A gallant little flourish he hadn't offered me in years. They drove off and I followed at a distance, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Until the neon glow of a roadside motel flickered into view. Its vacancy sign buzzing faintly in the night, I watched them disappear into room 12. Curtain pulled quickly shut, and something inside me hardened into steel. Because the evidence was no longer digital breadcrumbs or whispered suspicion. It was flesh and presence and a key turning in a cheap motel lock. And I knew the next move would no longer be silence, it would have to be mine. Saturday afternoon I drove back to that motel, sunlight beating down on the faded sign. And sat in the parking lot staring at room 12, curtains drawn. The air thick with the smell of asphalt and cut grass from the field nearby. I wasn't sure if I wanted to see them again or if I just needed to mark the place where the marriage had ended, a monument to betrayal with peeling paint and a buzzing soda machine by the office door. I thought about storming in, tearing open that curtain. But instead I walked into the front desk and asked for a receipt under his name. My voice steady though my hands trembled. And when the clerk slid the paper across the counter my breath caught, his signature sprawled at the bottom, time-stamped, undeniable. I folded it carefully, tucked it into my bag, and drove home in silence, the document heavy as a stone. When he returned that evening, showered and carrying takeout as if he had spent the day running errands, I laid the receipt on the kitchen table between us. His eyes flicked down, then up. And in that flicker I saw the truth collapse, the practiced stories crumbling. His mouth opening but no words forming. I didn't yell, didn't cry. Just told him the app had shown me the rides, the streets, the motel. And now the paper proved what my gut had screamed for weeks. He reached for me, stammering apologies, promises that felt like ash, but I stepped back. Because there was no space left for his touch. That night I packed a bag with the essentials, leaving behind framed photos, shared linens, the curated life we'd built. And as I closed the door I realized betrayal doesn't always come with fireworks or final shouts. It sometimes ends with a woman walking into the quiet night carrying nothing but proof. And a hollowed-out heart. I drove until the city lights thinned, pulling over at a rest stop where trucks hummed and cicadas buzzed in the dark. And for the first time in weeks I felt air fill my lungs without the weight of suspicion. The silence no longer poison but possibility, a space where I might begin again.